The first time I realized someone had been stealing from me, it wasn't because I caught them red-handed. It was because my electric bill landed in my mailbox looking like a bad joke. I've lived in rural New Mexico most of my adult life, just outside a little town called Cedar Ridge where people usually wave at each other, borrow tools without keeping score, and settle disagreements over coffee instead of lawyers. That's the kind of place I thought I knew, until my new neighbor reminded me that one selfish person can change the whole feel of a community. My name's Ethan Walker. I'm 43 years old, and I make my living rebuilding heavy equipment engines. My shop sits behind my house on 5 acres that my late father left me, a place that's always smelled like diesel fuel, cut steel, and fresh rain whenever the desert decides to be generous. My old Dodge pickup has more scratches than paint these days. My work boots are never clean. And honestly, I like life that way because every dent around here has a story behind it. Then, about 2 years ago, Melissa Grant bought the property next door. She came from Scottsdale with a luxury SUV, designer patio furniture, a perfectly landscaped backyard, and one of those expensive electric cars that looked more like a spaceship than something you'd actually drive across dirt roads. She introduced herself with a smile that somehow never reached her eyes. "I'm sure we're going to make this neighborhood a little more refined," she told me while looking around my workshop like it offended her personally. I laughed because I thought she was joking. Turns out she wasn't. At first it was little things. She complained about the sound of my air compressor in the afternoon, even though the county allowed it. She complained that customers driving into my property kicked up dust. She even suggested I paint my shop a different color because, according to her, it lowered the visual appeal of the road. Every conversation somehow ended with her explaining how things were done where she used to live. I'd smile, nod, then go back to rebuilding transmissions because I had better things to do than argue about landscaping trends. Around spring that year, my electric bill jumped almost $300. I blamed the heat. Then it happened again the next month. Then again. By the 4th month, I knew something wasn't right. My habits hadn't changed. Same machines, same hours, same lights. I even replaced old fixtures thinking maybe they were wasting power. But nothing explained why my usage kept climbing. One evening, I was locking up the shop after finishing a bulldozer transmission when I noticed something orange disappearing beneath the fence line. At first, I thought it was an extension cord one of my customers had forgotten, but when I followed it with my flashlight, it slipped through a gap near the property line and disappeared into Melissa's garage. I just stood there for a second because my brain honestly refused to believe what my eyes were seeing. The next morning before sunrise, I watched from inside my shop with a cup of coffee in my hand, and right on schedule she walked into her garage, plugged that expensive electric car into the orange cord running straight from my outdoor outlet, then walked back inside without a second thought. She wasn't hiding it. She acted like my electricity belonged to her. I unplugged the cord, coiled it neatly, and left a note on her front porch that simply read, "I think you accidentally connected your charger to my outlet. Please don't use my power." I figured maybe there was some misunderstanding. Maybe a contractor had done something stupid. Maybe she'd apologize. Instead, later that afternoon, I found the cord plugged back in exactly the way it had been before. This time, there was another note taped to my workshop door, laminated no less, like she expected it to last forever. It said, "It's only electricity. Don't be so petty. We all share this community." I actually laughed out loud because that sentence told me everything I needed to know about the kind of person living next door. To her, sharing only worked one way. She got the benefits. Somebody else paid the bill. My father used to tell me that anger makes people careless, but patience makes them expensive. So instead of yelling across the fence or calling the sheriff, I poured another cup of coffee, unlocked the old filing cabinet in my office, and started pulling property records that hadn't been opened in years. If Melissa believed we shared everything around here, I was about to find out exactly who really owned the system she depended on every single day. I spent the better part of that weekend sitting at my father's old oak desk with county maps spread across the surface, faded easement agreements, utility surveys, handwritten notes he'd kept from 30 years ago, and every document I could get my hands on from the county recorder's office. Dad believed paperwork could be just as powerful as a wrench if you knew how to use it. And somewhere along the way, I realized he was right. Around noon on Sunday, I found the page that changed everything. Back in 1981, when the original ranch had been divided into smaller parcels, the utility cooperative had installed a single transformer on what eventually became my property. Every service line feeding the neighboring parcel crossed my land under a private utility easement, but the transformer, the distribution cabinet, and the primary service account had always remained under the ownership and responsibility of whoever owned my lot. That was me. Melissa had every legal right to receive electricity through the easement, but she didn't own the infrastructure, and any additional high-load equipment installed after the original agreement required written approval from the infrastructure owner. I leaned back in my chair and couldn't help smiling. She hadn't just been stealing electricity. She'd connected a 48-amp EV charger without authorization to equipment that legally belonged to me. Monday morning, I drove into town and stopped by the electrical supply warehouse where the manager, Rick, had known me for almost 15 years. He watched me set a current sensor, industrial contactor, programmable relay, and a few other parts on the counter before raising an eyebrow. "Working on something interesting?" he asked with a grin. "Just fixing a load management problem," I answered honestly. He laughed and said, "Sounds expensive for somebody. Depends on who's paying for it," I replied. Back at the shop, I spent the afternoon upgrading my distribution panel. Nothing unsafe. Nothing illegal. I wasn't cutting anyone's power or damaging anyone's equipment. I simply programmed a load management cycle. If the branch feeding Melissa's unauthorized charger exceeded 30 amps, the relay would briefly disconnect the circuit for 10 seconds before restoring power automatically. Household appliances would barely notice, but an EV charger expecting a constant 48-amp supply would never complete a charging session. The beauty of it was that everything remained completely within the operating limits of my own equipment. Tuesday evening, I watched from the workshop window while the sun disappeared behind the mesas. Right on schedule, Melissa backed her luxury EV into the garage, plugged it in, glanced at the charging indicator, smiled, and walked inside. About 30 seconds later, the lights on the charger blinked. The connection stopped, then restarted, then stopped again. Another restart, another interruption. By the third cycle, I could see lights switching on inside her house. A few minutes later, she hurried into the garage wearing expensive athletic clothes, disconnected the cable, plugged it back in, stared at the screen on her phone, frowned, then repeated the whole process 3 more times. I simply sipped my coffee and went back to rebuilding a hydraulic pump. The next morning, she was already outside before I opened the shop. She crawled around the charger, checking every cable, called customer support through the car speakerphone, rebooted the system, and even blamed her home Wi-Fi before finally giving up. The funniest part wasn't watching the charger fail. It was watching someone who always claimed to have every answer suddenly realize technology couldn't solve everything. The cycle repeated for several days. Every evening, she'd confidently plug the car in. Every evening, the charging session would collapse a minute later. Every morning, she'd look more frustrated than the day before. By Friday, the local electrician's truck was parked in her driveway. I recognized the technician, a younger guy named Caleb, who occasionally bought rebuilt alternators from me. He spent nearly 2 hours inspecting her panel, testing voltage, checking wiring, and finally wandered over toward the shared utility cabinet with a puzzled look. He never opened it because he knew it belonged to my service account. Instead, he knocked on my workshop door. "Everything on your side looks good?" he asked casually. "Perfect," I answered. "Any issues with your equipment?" "Not a single one." He nodded slowly, looked back toward Melissa's house, and quietly said, "Well, this is going to be an interesting conversation." An hour later, his truck drove away, and Melissa looked even angrier than before. Whatever he told her clearly wasn't what she wanted to hear. Saturday afternoon, she finally stormed across the gravel driveway carrying her charging cable over one shoulder like evidence in a courtroom. "What did you do?" she demanded before I could even put down the transmission housing I was cleaning. "Good afternoon to you too," I said. "Don't play games with me." "My charger worked perfectly until this week," I shrugged. "Mine works fine. I don't own a charger," I added with a smile. Her face tightened. "You're interfering with my electricity." "Your electricity?" I repeated calmly. "That's an interesting choice of words." She crossed her arms. "Fix it. Today." I wiped my hands with an old shop towel, walked into my office, and came back carrying a large manila envelope. "Actually," I said, handing it to her, "before we talk about electricity, you should probably read this." She ripped it open immediately, expecting, I imagine, some maintenance report she could ignore. Instead, she found a neatly organized packet. The first page listed month-by-month estimates of unauthorized electricity consumption based on the charging rate of her vehicle and my recorded utility bills. The second page contained photographs of the extension cord connected to my exterior outlet on multiple dates with timestamps. The third included copies of county property maps highlighting transformer ownership and easement boundaries. The final pages contained a proposed utility agreement prepared by a local attorney I'd quietly hired 3 days earlier. Her confidence disappeared one page at a time. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, though her voice wasn't nearly as confident anymore. "No," I answered quietly. "What's ridiculous is thinking you could use someone else's electricity for 5 months and expect them to thank you for it." She flipped to the invoice and stared silently at the total. $1,480 for stolen electricity based on actual usage estimates, plus $2,000 in contractual penalties related to unauthorized commercial-grade equipment connected through privately maintained infrastructure. Total due, $34,380. Then she reached the final page, where the proposed agreement explained that any future high-load electrical installations connected through my infrastructure would require written approval, proportional maintenance contributions, and compliance inspections. She looked up at me with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You're actually serious?" I met her eyes without raising my voice. "I've been serious since the day I left you that first note. You were the one who decided being respectful was optional." She opened her mouth to threaten lawyers, but this time I interrupted before she could finish. "Go ahead. I'd actually welcome having a judge explain these documents to both of us." For the first time since she moved next door, Melissa didn't have a comeback. She simply looked down at the paperwork again, and I could almost hear the moment she realized this fight wasn't going to end the way she'd imagined. Melissa stood there longer than I expected, flipping through the paperwork as though reading it a second time might magically change the words. Finally, she looked up and said, "You're bluffing. No judge is going to care about an extension cord." I leaned against the workbench and smiled. "You're right. They won't care about the cord. They'll care about the 5 months of unauthorized electrical use. The photographs, the utility records, and the fact that you installed a high-load charging system on privately owned infrastructure without permission." For the first time since she'd moved in, I watched certainty leave her face. She folded the documents, tucked them back into the envelope without another word, and walked home. The next few days were surprisingly quiet. No complaints about my workshop. No comments about my truck. No passive-aggressive notes taped to my fence. Every evening I'd see her glance toward the utility cabinet before plugging in her car, and every evening the charger would cycle on. Shut off, restart, then give up entirely. She knew exactly why it was happening now, and more importantly, she knew I wasn't breaking any rules. About a week later, my mailbox held a certified envelope from her attorney. I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was how short the letter was. It requested documentation supporting my claims and proposed a meeting before either side pursued litigation. My own attorney, Linda Harper, laughed after reading it. "They're fishing," she said. "They don't know how strong your paperwork is yet." We met the following Thursday at a small conference room downtown. Melissa arrived wearing a tailored blazer instead of yoga clothes, carrying herself with the same confidence I'd seen on the day we first met, but confidence has a different look when it's built on hope instead of certainty. Her attorney spent nearly an hour reviewing surveys, easement language, utility records, photographs, and maintenance logs. The room grew quieter with every page. Finally, he removed his glasses, looked at Melissa, and spoke so calmly it almost sounded like an apology. "I think we need to discuss settlement." She stared at him. "Settlement? He's the one interfering with my electricity." He shook his head. "No, he's managing infrastructure he legally owns. Those are two very different things." She didn't say another word for the rest of the meeting. 5 days later, a cashier's check arrived for the full amount, along with a signed and notarized utility maintenance agreement drafted from the proposal I'd originally given her. There was no apology tucked inside. Honestly, I wasn't expecting one. Some people would rather pay thousands of dollars than admit they were wrong. Life settled down after that, at least on the surface. My electric bills returned to normal. My evenings became quiet again. The relay remained in place, ready to protect my equipment if anyone ever decided to ignore the agreement, but it never had to do its job again. 6 months later, a construction crew spent nearly 2 weeks installing solar panels across Melissa's roof along with a battery storage system that probably cost more than my workshop. One afternoon, I happened to be outside changing brake pads when the foreman walked over. "You're Ethan?" he asked. "That's me," he smiled. "Your neighbor wanted to make sure her house would never depend on your electrical infrastructure again." I couldn't help laughing. "Sounds expensive." He grinned. "Very." After they finished, her car charged from her own system every night without a problem. We still saw each other from time to time. Sometimes she'd wave politely. Sometimes she'd pretend not to notice me at all. Either way was fine by me because peace doesn't always come from becoming friends. Sometimes peace comes from clear boundaries that everyone finally agrees to respect. Looking back now, people often ask if I regret not simply shutting her power off the first day I found that extension cord. The truth is, I never wanted revenge. Revenge burns hot and disappears fast. Accountability lasts a lot longer. If I'd acted out of anger, I probably would have ended up creating a bigger mess for both of us. Instead, I let patience do the heavy lifting. And patience has a funny way of exposing greed without anyone having to raise their voice. Every time I unlock my workshop in the morning, I still see that old utility cabinet sitting near the fence line. Most people would walk past it without giving it a second thought. To me, it's a reminder that the strongest position isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes the strongest position is simply knowing exactly where you stand before someone else decides to cross the line. Now, I'd really like to hear what you think. If you discovered a neighbor had been using your electricity for months, would you have confronted them immediately? Or would you have handled it the way I did and let the facts speak for themselves? Was Melissa treated fairly? Or did I take things too far once I had the legal advantage? Share your opinion down in the comments because these kinds of neighbor disputes always seem to divide people. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next true-style story about property rights, difficult neighbors, and the unexpected ways ordinary people stand up for themselves.